So now let's start with the digital session. And Mr. Dale Turner, who is a professor of political science of the Center of Indigenous Studies at the University of Toronto. Mr. Turner is Anishinaabe on his father's side and a citizen of the Temagami First Nation. Listening to Indigenous peoples in and on their own terms. A warm welcome to Dale. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Oh my gosh, my head is, how's my hair? My head looks rather big on that stage. First of all, thank you very much for this kind invitation, and to my friend Michael Lindblad for the invitation. I realize I have just 25 minutes and 45 seconds, and I did a practice run yesterday, and it took me 2.5 hours. So I'm going to speed things up a little bit, but I do have a couple of, I think I have a couple of points to make about the Canadian experience, about the Anishinaabe experience, and how I see and understand contemporary Indigenous politics in Canada. So I'll have two parts. I think I'll say a little brief, a very brief history of Canadian Indigenous politics. And then I will say something about the politics of Indigenous translation, which is, I think, the where we have moved into in terms of our relationship with the Canadian state. And it seems that all Indigenous peoples, when they talk about their rights and their nationhood and their relationships to land, they often have to provide a kind of genealogy or history or context, and Canada is no exception. Where I choose to go back is to 1969, with the Canadian Liberal government. Pierre Elliott Trudeau was swept into power in 1968, and one of the things that he was set to do was to solve the Indian problem, as it's called over here, both in the U.S. and in Canada, and in shopped around what's called a white paper, and in this white paper, the goal or proposal was to, in a sense, get out of the Indian business. That the idea was that Indians would no longer have any special form of legal or political recognition. They would do away with the Indian Act, they would do away with the treaties, and the idea is that they would, Indigenous peoples would become citizens of the state along with every other Canadian. So it's driven by this liberal view of politics founded on two assumptions. One is the supremacy of state sovereignty, the federal government, and the other is that when we talk about morality, when we talk about rights, the fundamental moral unit of this language of rights is the individual. And the response to that was quite vehement, was quite loud, especially from the chiefs of Alberta, and came up with their own response in the form of a red paper, where basically they said, no, the idea is not to subsume us within the general public, but for the Canadian state to step up and honor their responsibilities in the relationship, namely for them, the treaty relationship. So we have in Canada this history of the state acting, imposing, characterizing Indigenous rights and sovereignty and nationhood, and then there's always an Indigenous response to this. And in this case, the white paper and the red paper, I believe, set in motion a politics that we have inherited and has evolved to this day. And I'll provide a couple of points along the way to demonstrate this. So first of all, through the 1970s, Canada was in this period of constitutional evolution of our constitution, constitutional reform. In one sense, the most important issue was how to deal with Quebec and Quebec's form of distinctiveness. However, Indigenous voices began to speak up, and as in the red paper, And in 1982, with the repatriation of our Constitution, our Constitution now has a second part to it, which is dedicated to Aboriginal rights. So Aboriginal people, so we went from being called Indians, now we're called Aboriginal. Aboriginal peoples consists of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. So from 1982 onwards, we have the relevant section is section 35.1, which has the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. So we're within this liberal model. The idea then was from 1982 onward to this day, it is that if an Indigenous nation, take an example, if they believe, well, let's go right to the land issue. If a community believes that they still own their homelands, and this is why BC and British Columbia politics is kind of leading the way in this, because there are just a small number of treaties. If they still own their land, then they have to take their case to court, present their case to court. The Supreme Court then takes all of the evidence and goes off and comes back and decides the meaning and content of our rights. Aboriginal title is a right to the land itself, and I'll talk about an important case in a minute. So Aboriginal peoples then, in some ways, see constitutional protection of our rights as a victory, a huge victory, and it was seen this way. I think what I would argue is the court has gone down a particular path in how they interpret the meaning and of our rights, namely in the context of culture. And this really comes out in two really important cases. One is the Vanderpeet case in 1996, and in 1997, the Delgamuukw case. Now, Vanderpeet is important because it was what was at issue was whether Dorothy Vanderpeet was arrested for selling salmon. They were charged under the Fisheries Act. Their argument was that they had a right to sell fish as an Aboriginal right, because this is what to hold the right. It ultimately comes back to title again. However, in this case, they said they had an Aboriginal right not to just fish, but also to sell fish, as we say. The court had an opportunity to decide the sort of meaning of this case, but what they did was they specifically characterized Aboriginal rights and related it to a cultural practice. So it came out with what was called the integral to a distinctive culture test. And what they needed to do, what the Stolo needed to do, was they needed to go into the court and explain to the court how this particular practice predated the arrival of Europeans, and that this practice of selling fish was integral to their culture. And not only that, the second part of that was the evidence and the way that you articulate your argument had to be, you had to use the language of the common law. So they had to go into court, explain how this particular practice of selling fish was integral or essential to their culture before the arrival of Europeans, show how that practice has been maintained. This, in my opinion, was and has been a devastating opinion for Indigenous peoples, because it placed their rights down a particular view, a path of cultural recognition, where the court gets to decide whether or not this particular practice is integral or essential to their culture. And not only that, but they have to do so using the language of the common law. Now, in response to this, the Delgamuukw decision, which some of you may be familiar with in terms of the Wet'suwet'en people now in pipeline politics in British Columbia, the Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en engaged in the language of common law, but the very important difference in their case was they also brought their own Indigenous law their own ways of understanding their relationships to land in particular, in claiming that they still own their land, owned as in outside the context of Aboriginal title. In other words, we were here first. We are on our lands, we owned our lands, everyone around us knew that before you arrived, and we still have that same relationship with the land today, and that relationship is understood in our own ways, in our own law, and it matters, and the court needs to recognize that the source of authenticity, of legitimacy of this form of ownership counts in and of itself. And it ought to play a role in how the court interprets the meaning of something like Aboriginal title, which is a right to the land itself. The court did not rule on this. They, through a technicality, ordered a retrial, but they also had this opportunity to say something definitive about Indigenous law in particular, and the role that Indigenous law plays in, first of all, its relationship with the common law, but as this kind of source of legitimacy, right, in the relationship, in particular over something like ownership. I think what makes Delgamuukw so important is that it created a kind of juridical space for Indigenous voices to be heard on their own terms. The court has yet to really do this full blown, and I think coming back to what I was saying before about the state imposing a particular way of understanding and interpreting Aboriginal rights, I'll stick to the common law, and the response to that in the communities in the various cases along the way, even up to the most recent cases, are in a sense to bring or to resist and make room for Indigenous law, their own ways of understanding their relationships to land as relevant to the way the court thinks about our rights. So the way to bring this to a kind of conclusion in this part is to say that there are two ways of characterizing Indigenous rights in Indigenous politics. One is what I call this delegated view. And this delegated view, as I said, with the white paper and with the Vanderpeet decision, what it does is it places the sovereignty of the state as supreme. State sovereignty is supreme. We can interpret, the state can grant Aboriginal rights, even protect them in the Constitution. However, at the end of the day, the sovereignty of the state is supreme. And the other thing that came out of Vanderpeet is that Aboriginal rights are characterized as a form of reconciliation between the laws and traditions and customs of Indigenous people with this, what I say is a unilateral assertion of state sovereignty. And the other thing that's key to this delegated view is that ultimately it's individuals that matter most in how we think about justice, individual rights. So once again, in the second part of the Constitution, Aboriginal rights are a form of group right, and this runs up against this certainly a dominant liberal view that only individuals are the possessor of rights. So to recognize a group right within that model just flies in the face sort of philosophically. However, the other view that's important here is what I call the inherent view. And this embraces what I call the language of nationhood. So the way, which involves a recognition of Indigenous law as the rightful source of understanding Indigenous people's relationships to land, and the hard work that we need to do as Canadians, in particular in law and politics, is to try to find ways to listen and accommodate Indigenous ways of knowing and being and Indigenous law into our contemporary politics. Now, what I think confuses this is that within the kind of liberal model, within the delegated view, there is this recognition of the inherent right. There is this kind of push over the last couple of decades to recognize Indigenous understandings and Indigenous languages and Indigenous law as relevant to how we understand and interpret the meaning of our rights as they are, for example, applied to public policy. However, Indigenous peoples constantly run up to this wall of the sovereignty of the state, trumping Indigenous understandings of nationhood, and that, I think, is what has characterized the relationship in a contemporary context. But what's happened now is Indigenous peoples along the way, in particular from the Idle No More movement in 2012, where there was this massive turn back to the land by Indigenous peoples, led by Indigenous women in particular, and to work with our young people to resituate how we understand ourselves as nations, how our own ways of thinking, our own languages. So language revitalization has been really key since 2012. It's been key for a long time, but really took on a different sort of direction. And I think what's happened is a lot of Indigenous people see the failure of the Supreme Court and Section 35 and that whole liberal model of characterizing and accommodating our rights as failing, right, to accommodate who we are and how we understand ourselves as nations. In particular, our relationships to land is relevant to how we understand ourselves as Indigenous peoples. And I think the politics has shifted to a period of what I call the politics of Indigenous translation. And what Indigenous peoples are trying to do now is not so much trying to find the right explanations for entering into a court of law using the language of the common law. And here, this is a really important distinction, and I think it's something that is really evolving in Canada, is that the common law is not going to go away. That's our reality, right? The reality is the nation state is going to continue to assert and exercise its power over Indigenous peoples. However, what we realize now is that turn back to the land itself and how we understand our relationships to self has, especially among our young people, created forms of empowerment that I think are not just simply making room in Canadian society for Indigenous cultural values, which of course is really an important part of this cultural recognition. But what goes along with that cultural recognition is a kind of epistemological politics. And what I mean by that is it's not so much the language that makes its difference. It's the language in relationship to the land and our ways of thinking that we need to make room for within Canadian society that comes up against the common law. So what I see about this in this turn back to the land is that we still need to engage the state. We still need our lawyers and politicians and people who are going to lead through the Indian Act, which is part of the Canadian legal political system, but that we also have our own law. And Indigenous laws becoming the third order of law in Canada. Law schools are now approaching it as a third order of law. So the form of reconciliation then is not simply how do we deal with the mistreatment of Indigenous peoples in the past in terms of our policies, which of course is integral to reconciliation, but that reconciliation also involves this very, in one sense, it's fundamental. In another sense, it's very deep. Recognition of a kind of resurgent Indigenous voice in Canadian politics, where our ways of understanding and explaining on our own terms is relevant to the well-being of Canada as a whole. And I think I might be getting close to being out of time. So a way that I see this then, the way to bring this together, is that Indigenous peoples' relationships to land remain at the heart of the forms of difference that Indigenous peoples want to bring into and have recognized it to be essential to how the Canadian state understands itself. So the common law then needs to evolve in ways that allows for the expression and the recognition of Indigenous law, our own ways, our own philosophies, our own relationships to land, to matter in how Canada is evolving as a nation state. So I'll stop there, and I thank you. I hope I made some sense anyway.
Thank you, Dale. If there is time at the end of the session, we will take some questions. So please, Dale, stay where you are. Okay, we will promptly continue with our next expert, who will discuss the ownership of the narrative and the importance of Sami self-governance in cultural management and funding. Ms. Maria Utsi is a Sami cultural worker and a leader from the Etno. She has a broad experience from the international arts and culture field and is the former director of the Arctic Arts Festival, the founder of the Arctic Arts Summit, and is today, among many other commitments, deputy chair of the Norwegian Arts Council. Maria, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Per Jonas. Dear all brothers and sisters of Sapmi, honored guests. As Per Jonas said, my name is Maria Utsi, and it's a great pleasure to be here today as part of this important event, even though I didn't have the chance to be with you in person in Stockholm. I come from Etno, Tana, on the Norwegian side of Sápmi, and I currently live in Tromsø. But I do work all over the Arctic as a consultant and project manager. In the last 15 years, I've held various leadership positions in Norwegian cultural life and work closely with the Sami cultural field also. And as Jonas said, for the last 7 years, I've also been appointed deputy chair of Norwegian Arts Council and been entangled in allocating broad funding to the independent art scene in Norway and Sápmi. And friends, let me tell you this. I am extremely concerned with power. The power of definition. Power to define what is important, what is right, what is relevant, what is good, and what is bad. And maybe most importantly, what is art and what is artistic freedom. This power can be both formal and informal. Sometimes it's difficult to detect, but always equally important. I therefore thought I would talk to you today about cultural management and funding from a power perspective and try to outline some structural challenges that today stand in the way of equality between the Sami and the majority population when it comes to the premises for arts and culture, funding and development, and therefore in the way of equal artistic freedom. Much of this will probably be known to you already. We know that the conditions are not the same and that the imbalance in funding between Sami and majority institutions is real and seemingly not changing. However, I would like to share some reflections with you from my 7 years as a member at the Norwegian Arts Council and from my experiences with both policymaking and strategic development of funding and support structures for the independent art scene in Norway. Let me start with stating what might come across as a bit harsh. I will argue that there is very limited understanding for the formal core premises for Sami societal and cultural development, which in a Norwegian context is Article 108 in our constitution. It says, the authorities of the state shall create conditions enabling the Sami people to preserve and develop its language, culture, and way of life. I do find that highly interesting. What are these conditions? Wouldn't it be fair to think that the conditions at least should be the same for both majority and Sami artists? Are the conditions equal today? I would argue not at all. And I do think that we more often should refer to the Constitution itself when arguing for changes. Funding and creating the right conditions is not a nice gesture. It is a commitment authorized by law. We must not forget that. The question is therefore, what conditions are necessary to enable the Sami arts field to develop equally and sustainably in the future? Today, the funding of the Sami arts field is essentially managed by the Sami parliament. As some of you probably know, the differences between the three parliaments' cultural budgets are striking. Yet they all manage budgets that are significantly smaller than the needs of the field they are set to serve. So not only is the funding insufficient, it also creates great differences within Sapmi and leads to the fact that the artists and institutions' room for action in no way can be seen as equal to the rest of the national arts field. It also limits the extremely important collaborations across the national state borders in our nation, our Pan-Sami community. The insufficiencies in Sami parliament funding for culture therefore makes artists and organizations dependent on national funding. Funding allocated through systems that are not built for diverse realities, experiences, traditions, and practices. The Norwegian Arts Council was established in 1965 and has, through soon to be 60 years, been supporting and stimulating the independent professional art scene in Norway. The establishment can be said to be part of an extensive nation building after the Second World War, where one of the main motivations was to secure Norwegian literature and art in competition with an increasingly strong influence from the growing pop culture in America. I am truly proud of the Norwegian Arts Council and the system that facilitates peer assessment at an arm's length from political governance. However, the system is not built for diversity. It's built to identify artistic quality through the peers' own experiences and references. It is built for recognition and familiarity, and it will always seek what is known all over Scandinavia and European cultural management as high artistic quality. as if that is one specific and objective asset, intuitively identifiable for those with the right frame of reference and knowledge. This, my friends, is a very slippery slope. Intuition comes from our previous experiences, our education, and our professional training. The intuition is trained to recognize what is known to us. It is not a magical ability to identify objective and universal artistic quality, if I may say so. In a system based on intuitive recognition and the ability to identify what is already known and appreciated, Sami art will often come short. It is no one there to mirror and reflect the artistic perspectives, the realities, the urgencies, and motivation. And the projects will seem unknown, irrelevant, and incomprehensible. The concept of artistic quality is an anachronism originating from old European art academia. It is a concept of power, which today serves no other purpose than to support the status quo. The art is truly a mosaic of different qualities in plural and context. It always has been. It just hasn't been recognized as that. This relentless pursuit of high artistic quality has also contributed to Sami artists experiencing balancing on a tightrope. The drop height is great, and the room for experimentation can feel smaller when the needle's eye for recognition is so small. And I must remind you, the ability to fail is a natural and necessary part of any artistic practice. For Sami artists seeking national funding and recognition, this can seem as a privilege reserved for someone else. To quote my good colleague from the Kultursapmi think tank arranged by the Sami Council, festival director Johan Gaup, he said, "I'm so fed up with bad music from Guadageno. I really want to hear bad music from Kariswanto also." My point is, the majority art field has the privilege of failing, of being bad, and this creates a necessary and inspiring dynamic. When faced with national funders and assessments, Sami artists do not enjoy the same privilege. And, good people, we haven't even mentioned yet the language barrier, the fact that many Sami artists have to express their artistic intentions in their second language. Neither have we addressed the obligation for explanation. Not explanation of the artistic project or plan, that's obvious, but of the fundamental context, the cultural overview, and cultural differences. As a Sami applicant, you first have to state the obvious, explain the cultural context, and then the artistic content. Often all in a language that is not your mother tongue, with words and concepts that are not created to reflect your worldview and tradition. The conditions, ladies and gentlemen, as the Constitution refers to, are not equal. The power of definition has already been distributed. The national structures for art support have also realized this over the past few years, at least to a certain extent. To compensate for blind spots and missing frames of reference, a massive investment in diversity has therefore been initiated. More diverse assessment committees has been appointed and diversity project has been started. When former director of the Indigenous Department at Canada Council for the Arts, Stephen Loft, was asked during a panel talk at the Arctic Arts Summit in 2019 how allocation of funding could be arranged better from an Indigenous perspective. He simply answered, "Put more Indigenous people in the assessment committees." And I absolutely agree with him. It's given, it's obvious, but I still don't think that pure representation will change the structural problems in our funding system alone. Representation should always be seen as obvious. It goes without saying. It's not, however, a magic potion to solve structural issues with diversity. Representation alone has its way to burden individuals with the responsibility of fixing diversity and can often appear as an actual disclaimer for funding bodies and national institutions. No real change happens. No power is allocated. The minority representative has it covered. Diversity is fixed. This is, of course, not sustainable. Distribution and allocation of power is the only way forward towards a more equal condition for artists and applicants in Sapmi. And I wish I could say that the feasible and only solution would be to give the Sami parliament more money to allocate. That is both necessary and urgent, but it will not change the normative and self-referential practice of the national funding systems. It will only shift the responsibility exclusively to the Sami authorities and become a free pass to continue business as usual from a national perspective. To create lasting change, to change the conditions, we have to distribute the power to redefine the core concepts of the assessment practices. Concepts as relevance, quality, and professionality, even the concept of art itself. Because what happens when Sami art is no longer a hot potato? Those who manage the power of definition decided that Sami art was suddenly interesting. Through Documenta, via Venice, and into the national institutions. But have they moved over, made space for us? Have they made room for other truths, new realities, and complementary perspectives? Has change really happened? Or can they, at the next crossroads, embrace a new venture, a different focus? And what are we left with then? What structural changes have occurred in the funding systems, in the national institutions, in the Sami institutions' budgets? As I have experienced these systems over many years, the solution is not only to move money, but to change the conversation, create a broader normative, force complementary perspectives. Structural change is about changing the way we do things, the way we think, the way we talk, what we emphasize as important, what we consider truth. The premises for why we do what we do. It's about picking apart, one by one, the defining terms, the hinges that create an inside and an outside, the proper art on one side and then everything else. The diversity projects pop up in every governmental body these days, and I love it. It's imperative, it's critically timely, and it's absolutely an absolute necessity. But investing in Sami culture to create equal conditions for the Sami arts field is not a diversity project. It is a legal and moral obligation not to be questioned or challenged. The obligation is anchored both in legislation and in international agreements. It is not a choice made by goodwill. Hardly controversial, but still, with this in mind, from my side of the border, it is difficult to understand how the Swedish government can think or calculate that the Sami parliament's budget should cover their lawful obligation to facilitate the Sami people's ability to develop their culture, language, and society. The way forward will be winding. Structural changes do not appear suddenly. They are the result of systematic and persistent work. We need, however, to be present in the funding systems. We need to be present where power of definition is exercised. I know that it's a tiring job to be the Sami alibi, the representative, to explain, to educate, to be accommodating and understanding, to always make sure to be the right amount of Sami, not too much. The majority tends to find it a bit tiring. Not too little, then you lose yourself. And good people, we need to discuss, reflect, learn, and collaborate on our own terms. We need to define for ourselves what do we need to thrive and strengthen our artistic communities and institutions. How can systems be arranged and managed in a way that reflects our realities and our artists' needs? Let me return to the initial question. What conditions are necessary to enable the Sami arts field to develop equally and sustainably in the future? I salute and thank you for arranging such a great summit with the ability to investigate that crucial question. Please do so, and please elbow and force your way into any context where the premises for development of the art field are discussed. There is no other path to change. Thank you so much for listening, and the best of luck with the rest of Summit. I'm Maria Utsi, over and out from Romsa, Tromsø.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Now let's continue to the last speaker of this session, which will reflect on Sami performance, higher education, and cultural rights. Mr. Dirk Gint is a professor of theater studies in the Department of Culture and Aesthetics at Stockholm University, however now presenting from Montreal. So good morning, or should I say good night. Dirk, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to Mikael Lindblad and Maya Bonta, and also thank you to Dale Turner and Maria Utsi for two very stimulating presentations here. Can I assume that my PowerPoint will be projected simultaneously as I speak? Hello?
The presenter, yeah, now.
Yeah.
Now.
Okay, good.
Good.
Thank you. So I'd like to start off with two acknowledgements. First, I'm zooming in from the city of Montreal, or Tiohtià:ke, which is located on the unceded indigenous lands of the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation, who are the custodians of the lands and waters on which I find myself today. Second, I'm very honored to have been invited to this fourth Sami Cultural Summit, and I come to the table in a humble and respectful way. I do so as a settler theatre scholar who is critically analysing the history of Kiron Sami Theater in dialogue and consultation with the ensemble, staff, board of directors, and artistic director. My objective here today is to make a claim for the importance of higher education and the performing arts for the strengthening of Sami cultural rights, and I will do so with selected references to a Canadian and a Swedish context. Next slide, please. Published in 2015, the final report of Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, included a list of 94 calls to action with concrete recommendations to increase the rights of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, promote their welfare, and implement compensations for the colonial crimes committed. An entire section of these 94 calls is devoted to the topic of language and culture and highlights, among others, the necessity to preserve and strengthen Indigenous languages, the need to create culturally appropriate high school and university curricula, and the importance of granting Indigenous peoples and communities the right to be in charge of bolstering their own cultures, an endeavor that should be appropriately funded. The reason I ground my presentation in the Canadian TRC is to underline the significance of culture, language, and education in the reconciliation processes that are unfolding across the circumpolar region. Next slide, please. When the Sami Parliament of Sweden in 2020 published its report to argue for a National Truth Commission, the document emphasized the need to educate on forced displacements, anthropometric observations, and assimilation processes in the nomad schools, and insisted on the Sami people's rights to their lands since times immemorial. In addition, the report demanded better language programs, argued for increased financial support and autonomy for Sami culture, and suggested placing more emphasis on Sami topics, as well as Swedish and Nordic colonial history in high school and university curricula. Next slide. Now, the Canada Council for the Arts, as has already been mentioned, has an Aboriginal Arts Office, which means that there is a specific pot of money devoted to funding projects by Indigenous cultural workers. In the 2020-21 season, the Council awarded a total of 23.7 million Canadian dollars, which is almost 17 million euro, to Indigenous-led cultural projects, surpassing its own goal of $18.9 million. This is quite an impressive number if we compare it to Thomas Bogstad's report on the conditions for Sami culture, in which he reveals that the Swedish state offers a meager 18 million Swedish kronor or 1.8 million euro as annual support to Sami cultural institutions. Now, I know that Stephen Loft, who's also already been mentioned and who is the former director of the Aboriginal Arts Office of the Canada Council, has been a speaker at a previous Sami Cultural Summit, so I will not dwell on this issue, but I simply wish to remind us all of the staggering differences of financial support to Indigenous culture in various circumpolar countries. What I instead wish to illustrate a bit more detail here is how the TRC and its 94 calls to action are also making a mark on higher education. And I will do so by taking Concordia University in Montreal as a case study. Next slide, please. In 2019, Concordia hit the national news when it revealed its Indigenous Directions Action Plan, which is an explicit attempt to decolonize and indigenize the university. The action plan is a direct response to the TRC, but also references the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It seeks to move the university, and I quote, towards a more equitable and inclusive future where Indigenous peoples' knowledges, research, and scholarship are prioritized and celebrated. Furthermore, and I quote again, it is committed to taking concrete steps towards the decolonization and indigenization of our institution in order for us to co-construct a new shared future based on responsibility, reciprocity, relevance, and respect. Now, the action plan recognizes how Western or Eurocentric universities have long contributed to and therefore need to actively intervene against systemic discrimination. More than paying lip service to this fact, the action plan stakes out a roadmap to a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive university that welcomes Indigenous knowledges and offers a safe space for Indigenous students, faculty, and staff. It affects all levels of the university organization, from senior administration to the classroom and beyond. Initiatives that have already been implemented range from community engagement and sensitivity training to curricular modifications and the implementation of language programs. Furthermore, there are ongoing special hiring initiatives to recruit Indigenous as well as Black and people of color researchers and instructors, in addition to concrete reforms to attract and retain Indigenous students. Crucially, an annual budget to support Indigenous-led projects and events has also been established. The reason I am highlighting Concordia is because I speak from the position of a university professor and settler scholar. The Indigenous Directions Action Plan shows the impact that a well-designed and well-implemented TRC can have on higher education, and thereby also on language and culture. Now, I do not wish to bite the hand that feeds me, but I believe that if Stockholm University were asked to produce a similar document at this current moment, many people's heads would pop off. And yet, it is my hope that once the Swedish Truth Commission has conducted and concluded its work, my home academic institution will take it upon itself to also engage in the simultaneous processes of decolonizing and indigenizing the university. Next slide, please. And let's say a few words about the term decolonization here. In the inaugural issue of the journal Decolonization, Indigeneity, Education and Society, Eve Tuck and Kei Wayne Yang famously posit that decolonization is not a metaphor. Decolonization, they argue, must not be misconstrued as the latest fancy academic theory that is confined to the seminar room. Neither must it be deployed as what Tuck and Yang identify as settler moves to innocence, that is, and I quote, strategies or positionings that attempt to relieve the settler of feelings of guilt or responsibility without giving up land or power or privilege, end quote. The heart of the matter is that decolonization is about Indigenous peoples' rights to their lands, waters, and resources, and Indigenous peoples' rights to compensation for stolen lands, waters, and resources. Decolonization, according to Tuck and Yang, is a hard and painful process that will not necessarily lead to a satisfactory outcome, let alone reconciliation for all parts involved. Importantly, though, they do admit that this should not preclude the necessity of solidarity and education. Next slide, please. Now, while I do not disagree with this statement, I also wish to credit the important work of Maori Indigenous education scholar Linda Tuiwai-Smith. In her seminal book, Indigenous Methodologies, Smith reminds us that decolonial labor must offer what she calls a language of possibility, which is where the power of the imagination plays an important role. Smith writes, and I quote, "Imagining a different world, or reimagining the world, is a way into theorizing the reasons why the world we experience is unjust, and posing alternatives to such a world from within our own worldviews." The transformative agency and contributions of cultural representations and live performances must not be underestimated here. And now I tend to make a passionate claim for the importance of performance here, so bear with me, please. As a theatre scholar, I'm particularly interested in the dialectical relationship between the performing arts and society. Theatre is not a passive mirror of contemporary social norms, political concerns, or power structures, but an active participant in these, and thus helps shape social reality. Moreover, there's a strong educational dimension to performance, as it exposes us to stories and characters whose experiences allow us to discover a world beyond our own. The very act of coming together and celebrate community for the duration of a performance creates intellectual and emotional bonds between audiences and performers that can outlast the duration of the actual performance and form the seed for critical thinking, and maybe even activist intervention. After all, as the Brazilian theatre director Augusto Boal famously posits in his book Theatre of the Oppressed, and I quote, "Perhaps the theatre is not revolutionary in itself, but have no doubts, it is a rehearsal of revolution." Next slide, please. The Algonquian playwright, director, and actor Yvette Nolan has suggested that Indigenous performance works as metaphorical medicine to extract the poison and damage caused by settler colonialism. Nolan states, and I quote, "Indigenous theatre artists make medicine by reconnecting through ceremony, through the act of remembering, through community building, and by negotiating solidarities across communities. The stage, as Sami cultural historian Veli-Pekka Lehtola argues, offers the means to take control of self-representation, promote languages, negotiate cultural identities, and foster positive self-identification." In personal interviews that I have conducted with Åsa Simma, she emphasizes the power of storytelling and the power of a narrative in which audiences can recognize themselves as a means to stimulate social change. Next slide, please. As many of you know, Åsa Simma is the artistic and managing director of Giron Sami Teater, and I will now proceed to a short description of my research about the company, which is Sweden's oldest and largest professional Sami ensemble. My project seeks to chart the history of Giron Sami Teater by analyzing processes of production and reception of selected historical and contemporary plays and performances. It also studies the company's long fight to become anointed a fully state-financed Sami national theatre. As a second aim, the project highlights the decolonial labor of Sami performance, which represents, stages, embodies, and challenges the manifold abuses committed against the Sami by Swedish and Nordic settler colonialism. As previously mentioned, the work is conducted in consultation and dialogue with the artists and staff at Giron Sami Teater, to whom I wish to emphasize my gratitude and respect here. Next slide. My scholarly and ethical approach is indebted to Rauno Kokkanen's rich work on Sami self-determination, which prescribes the social, moral, and academic responsibility of Western scholars to help implement the necessary changes for a broader and genuinely diverse university. According to Kokkanen, and I quote, "It is up to the academy to do its own homework and address its own ignorance so that it will be able to recognize and give an unconditional welcome to Indigenous peoples' worldviews and philosophies." End quote. Doing one's homework, in turn, requires a recognition of the narrow understanding of what constitutes knowledge upon which Western universities base their curricula and research programs. To oppose the epistemic ignorance that has also left its trace on my own discipline, namely theatre and performance studies, I rely on Kokkanen's notion of the gift, which she suggests as a means to highlight Indigenous knowledges and encourage relationships that are characterized by respect, responsibility, and reciprocity. Following Kokkanen, I propose approaching Sami performance as a gift to embrace the relationships and responsibilities that this denotes. Performance, maybe more than any other art form, is about mutual relationships, respect, trust, and communication, which I believe makes it particularly suitable as a means to decolonize and indigenize culture, education, and society. I wish to round off my presentation by briefly illustrating this statement with an example from one of Giron Sami Teater's more recent productions, Colonial Nation, a theatrical truth and reconciliation commission, which opened in February 2017. Next slide, please. Directed by Paulina Feodorov, Colonial Nation was a collective documentary theatre project that assembled anonymized oral histories and witness testimonies from all over Sapmi to explore the manifold legacies of settler colonialism in Northern Europe. A key impulse for the project was provided by the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, including, I should say, the methodology. As hinted at in the intriguing spelling, colonial nation confronted multiple intersecting colonial realities that the Sami people face, including the negative effects of the geopolitical borders that continue to divide Sapmi, the struggle for self-determination, and the impact of global climate change on their land and living conditions. An equally prominent dimension of colonial nation was the celebration of indigenous resistance and agency, the demand to tell one's own story on one's own terms, and the desire to give a voice to a colonized people whose stories, experiences, and identities are often manipulated, commercialized, or silenced by a majoritarian society. Next slide, please. The production purposefully boycotted the colonial gaze, refused to feed into narratives of Sami victimhood, and set the terms for its own Truth and Reconciliation Commission within the first 5 minutes. Actor Elina Israelsson stepped forward to address non-Sami audiences in Swedish and thanked them for attending the performance. The ritualistic act of welcoming audiences into a shared performance space was an act of generosity. Colonial nation was offered as a gift. Accepting this gift also meant honoring the responsibilities that came with it. Israelsson asked non-Sami audiences to maintain a respectful distance and realized that catering to them was not the primary concern of the production. Next slide, please. And here a quote from Israelsson's opening speech. Colonization is not a shared experience between the one who is colonizing and the one who is subjected to it. We have two entirely different roles in this story, in this history. Israelsson further explained the lack of Sami visibility in mainstream culture and discourse, which is why the performance marked an intervention. I continue quoting. We're talking about our shared experience as a people, as Sami, and you are welcome to share our shared experience with us, to witness. And maybe this can become a shared experience, the fact that we are sharing. This is a tremendously powerful scene on an artistic, intellectual, and emotional level, which I hope ties up my reflections on the interrelation between Sami culture, performance, and higher education against the background of circumpolar politics of truth and reconciliation. Sami performing artists and cultural workers show us how storytelling, witness testimonies, live performance, language, and education are intertwined. My hope is that the final report produced by the Swedish Truth Commission will put a similar emphasis on the significance of these fundamental values and thereby strengthen Sami rights and Sami culture. With reference to Rauno Kokkanen, I conclude with an encouragement for Swedish government authorities and political decision makers to recognize Sami culture and performance as a gift and to treat it accordingly. Kiitos.
Thank you, Dirk. Unfortunately, we do not have time for questions. We are behind schedule. But I encourage you all to seek contact with the presenters directly and send in your questions afterward. Thank you, Dale. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Dirk. A special thanks for those who got up in the middle of the night to present. I hope you will get some sleep now.